Hi everyone, Katie Bickford here. Most of you won't recognize me because I took a few months off school, so I ended up back here while the people I initially took class with obviously moved forward, so hello. I'm here with my library assignment, and for that assignment I chose to do Once Upon a Time Out of the Past. This is a graphic novel that is obviously based on ABC's television program Once Upon a Time. The creative team behind it are Kalinda Vasquez and Corinna, forgive me if I pronounce her last name incorrectly, Beshko. And those, the two of them are behind the story of the book. And then the creatives behind the artwork is a collaborative effort between Pascal Campion, Betsy Peterschmidt, Vanessa Del Rey, and Janet Lee. It's published by Marvel Comics. It's 112 pages long, so it's not very long at all, I don't think. I'm not a graphic novel connoisseur, so I don't know what the standard length is, but to me it seemed short. And it is a compilation. As you can see, it is a compilation of 4 different stories surrounding 4, or I guess 5, obviously, characters from the show. Now, as far as the creative team is concerned, Kalinda Vasquez was a co-producer and a member of the writing team for the show from seasons 1 until I believe she left sometime in season 4. Yeah, I think she left between the first half of season 4 and the second. So she is no longer associated with the show, but she was from the beginning until somewhat recently. And then the artwork is interesting. You'll notice that I mentioned quite a few names in relation to the creative team behind the artwork, and that is because each one of these 4 stories here on the cover are all illustrated by somebody different, which I thought was really interesting and really cool because I've never read a graphic novel where of the few I've read, I've never read a graphic novel where the illustrations were in different styles. Obviously each artist brought their own style to the illustrations. So you'll notice that in the very first story featured in the book, which is about Captain Hook, the artwork looks like this. It's a little more simplistic than, I believe. Well, no, it's not. It's not more simplistic than the Hatter story, I don't believe, but it's a little more simplistic than 2 of the other illustration styles in here, which I'll show you as soon as I can find where Rumple and Belle's story begins. Oh, here we go. And then the second story in the book features Rumpelstiltskin and Belle from Beauty and the Beast. And these ones are done in just this gorgeous, gorgeous watercolors. Absolutely beautiful. And then the 4th story in the book is centered around Regina, the Evil Queen. And this illustration style is something that I'm more used to when it comes to graphic novels. Of the few that I've read, they've all kind of been more in this kind of vein as far as the illustrations go. And then the last one in the book is about Jefferson, aka the Mad Hatter. And this one to me is more of a traditional kind of almost children's storybook type of illustration. It's very colorful, it's very fanciful, but at the same time it's kind of simple, so it's quite lovely. So I'm going to, because this is a compilation and because I tend to get very rambly and stuttery when recording videos like this, I'm actually going to be recording 4, well, technically 5, separate short videos and cobbling them together just so that I can keep everything cohesive. So that was me explaining all of the basics, and I will get into the very first story in the book called Dead in the Water in just a moment. So the first story in Once Upon a Time Out of the Past, chapter 1, is called Dead in the Water. It begins right here. I'm not used to this video screen, so you have to bear with me for a second. And this story centers on Killian Jones, aka Captain Hook, a character that was introduced in the second season of Once Upon a Time. And in this story, we see him now. The time frame in this story isn't really clearly defined. If I had to guess, I would say this is before we see him enter the story in season 2. Just during his time either in Neverland or one of the many times he visited the Enchanted Forest before he came to Storybrooke in season 2. Some of you aren't going to understand what this means because you haven't seen the show. I should have noted this in my first recording. As far as recommending this book and any of you reading this book, I will say you definitely need to have seen the show to understand what's going on in this book, because it portrays a lot of events that you need the characters' backstories for, like especially their flashback backstories that happen in the show. If you haven't seen at least up until the end of season 3 of the show, you're not really going to understand a lot of what happens. So as a note, definitely, if you intend on reading this, you definitely need to watch the show first. Anyway, this story centers on Killian. Him and his crew on the Jolly Roger are in a storm, and Killian sails them into kind of these mysterious, kind of treacherous, like, waters that kind of can cause hallucinations and the like. Now, if I had to pinpoint where Act 1 ends and Act 2 begins, it's on these pages here, and then specifically this panel right here. Oh my goodness. This is difficult. This panel right here. When he decides that escaping the storm into what they call the Leviathan Shoals, escaping the storm is considered more worthwhile than whatever risk the Leviathan Shoals pose to them, as far as the hallucinations and things go. So this is definitely where Act 2 begins, and the waters become calmer instantly, and things begin to seem a little out of place. What happens here, let me move my screen so that I don't look like, oh, here we go. What happens here is that Hook comes into contact with who he believes to be his older brother, Liam. The problem is that Liam is dead. He died in Neverland several centuries before this story takes place. I assume several centuries at least. So basically, the gist of this story is Killian, who loves his brother very much. They were all each other had for a long time, and his brother's kind of his idol. He has to come to terms with the fact that this is a hallucination and his brother isn't real, and that is Killian's whole story arc within this very short story. I mean, the whole thing's only like, I want to say 21 pages. So it all happens very fast paced, but Killian does have a complete character arc. He goes from steadfastly refusing to believe that it's hallucination, he's just happy to have his brother back, to kind of realizing that in order to get his shipmates and his ship, the Jolly Roger, that he loves very much, out of danger, he has to, reconcile the fact that this isn't his brother. His brother's not real. And he essentially has to leave, I'll show you, he has to leave Liam behind on the burning remains of a lifeboat, just going with the assumption he came to terms with that he's not real. He doesn't have proof, but he has to be willing to let his brother go. And that's kind of his character arc there, because he was never able to properly let his brother go, because when he died, he didn't get to say goodbye to him. So he definitely has a complete character arc. And then as far as how it flows very well. There's no skipping, there's no feeling of incompleteness or like they jumped the shark or anything like that. You know, the transitions are excellent. You always know what's going on. You always know where you are and where the characters are and what happens to each one of them. So there's no hiccups there. And other than that, it's just a very solid story. Hook is my second favorite character on the show after Emma Swan. So I very much enjoyed reading this, and it felt very in character. I feel like Kalinda definitely, well, obviously Kalinda would understand, but I also feel like Corinna also got his character down very well. And as far as the resolution and the conclusion of the story goes, it was satisfactory in a narrative sense. Like, it made sense that, you know, he would have to let his brother go and kind of put the good of his ship and his own life and the life of his men above this kind of almost dream of his brother. So it was satisfactory in that sense. In a personal sense, I would always prefer that Liam Jones be alive, because I love Killian and I love his brother, as short a presence he has on the show. I love his brother and their relationship. So from a personal standpoint, I would like Liam to have been real. But as far as the story goes and how it ties into the show, the resolution is very concrete and it works very well. So that's it for that one. All right, and chapter 2 of the book is right here. This is the one that focuses on Rumpelstiltskin and Belle, aka Beauty and the Beast. That's one of the cool things about Once Upon a Time, for those of you who don't watch it. It makes its bones on kind of putting twists on the classic fairy tales, whether they're the classic well-known fairy tales, as well as, you know, the kind of the sugar-coated Disney versions of them, is that they take the fairy tales and they kind of put these cool twists on them. Like Rumpelstiltskin, for instance. They combined a lot of fairy tale characters with him. Not only is he Rumpelstiltskin, but he's also the Beast from Beauty and the Beast. He's also a human embodiment of the crocodile from Peter Pan. He's also the Pied Piper. I'm sure there's a few more I'm forgetting because he's a lot of them. And another example would be the evil queen from Snow White. Her mother is the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland, and she's also the miller's daughter from Rumpelstiltskin. So you see, they like to take the characters and give them those added identities. So you're combining a lot of the characters. Anyway, the story focuses primarily on Belle, which is a nice change, because on the show, she's almost kind of a prop for Rumpelstiltskin's character, which can be frustrating. So it's nice to see this story focus on her. The gist of this story is that Belle, who is a captive of Rumpelstiltskin's, just like and is staying in his castle, just like the classic Beauty and the Beast tale where Belle stays with the Beast. Belle comes across a wounded soldier from the Ogre Wars, which are occurring in this time frame. This happens in the past of the show, in their flashback format time frame. And Belle comes across a wounded soldier who's a childhood friend of hers. And she brings him back to the castle to heal him. And speaking of that, that is where I would say the end of Act 1 is, and the beginning of Act 2 is where she brings her wounded friend back to Rumpel's castle and is able to convince Rumpel to let her wounded friend Samuel stay there so that she can heal him. Belle's character arc in this story is very thorough, and it's very in line with how she is in the show. Belle is borderline obsessed with being a hero, mainly because, she reads about heroic deeds in her books that she loves so much, which is consistent with Disney's Belle. And she wants to save Samuel not only because he was her friend, but because it's the heroic thing to do, and it's the compassionate thing to do. And she's a very compassionate character. It's why she's able to accept Rumple and love Rumple, even though he's kind of a monster. This story has a lot of twists, because at first we believe that Samuel has just been wounded in the Ogre Wars, but then he tells Belle, I think starting right here, that her father has sent him to rescue her from her captivity in Rumple's castle. And then we see yet another twist later when Belle realizes, or deliberately finds out because something doesn't seem right, that his second story about her father sending him is also not true. He's actually a leader of a band of mercenaries, and he was after Rumple's Dark One dagger to use to control him and kind of plunder the entire Enchanted Forest. For those of you who don't watch the show, Rumple is something that you call the Dark One. He's basically an all-powerful cursed entity, and the only way you can control him is with the use of this dagger. Basically, you have it, he has to do whatever you say, as long as you're holding the dagger. So Belle has a very complete character arc in this story, and it's very fulfilling for how short of a story it is. Again, it's only about 20 pages, roughly. And you kind of do see, consistent with the show, the inklings of Belle beginning to feel more towards Rumpelstiltskin than just him as her captor. Right here, she deliberately sends Samuel away when he tells her that his plan is to capture Rumpelstiltskin in Pandora's box. So you can definitely see where she's starting to shift from just being his captive housekeeper to definitely feeling more for him. The story flows very well from beginning to end. Nothing is amiss. The entire story, not only through the beauty of the illustrations, but just the emotion and the... there's actually a little bit of a mini flashback format in this story. Like, we don't actively see Belle discover the truth about Samuel. We see her having a conversation with Rumple after she sends Samuel away, saying something didn't seem right, so I went and that's the flashback where she goes and finds out through plans he had in his satchel that he was planning on controlling Rumple with the dagger. So yeah, it's a very consistent story. It doesn't do, nor did the Hook story, it doesn't use the one page as a mini comic format. It's condensed enough. This book is condensed enough as it is with 4 stories. So they do not do that, which I prefer, actually. So, all right, on to the next one. All right, and the third story in the book, it's right here. This one is focused on Regina, a.k.a. the evil queen from Snow White. It's titled Ghosts. And this story is even shorter than the other two. It seems a lot, I don't want to say empty, but just a lot more sparse emotion and plot-wise than Hook's story and Belle's story. Basically, the gist of it is the evil queen is out in her carriage that she's in like every single time we see her on the show ever. Looking for Snow White. Bit of backstory for those of you who don't watch the show. Obviously, they changed the evil queen and Snow White's backstory up a little bit to make it a little deeper than just, oh, she's prettier than me, that's why I don't like her. Basically, what it is that Regina, the evil queen, blames Snow for the death of her lover, Daniel. And that's why she's out for vengeance, which is like the entire plot of the first season of the show. Anyway, what happens is that Regina's out and they enter this forest called the Forest of the Dead. That's not ominous at all. It does set the tone for the story right away, and as being very ominous, which is also helped along by the darkness and kind of the almost messy sketch quality of the illustrations, which I think pulls the story together very nicely. her carriage crashes. She ends up in a very deep pit in the ground. And as it turns out, this was all a setup by Daniel's brother, William, who, like Snow, wants revenge, or like Regina, wants revenge on Snow for Daniel's death. William blames Regina, and he wants revenge on Regina for Daniel's death. Like I said, the story is pretty sparse, so basically the gist of it is that William fails, sorry. Regina gets out of the pit, blasts him with her magic before he's able to kill her, and he dies. And the resolution is that Regina is just like now double fold into her quest for revenge against Snow. Like, that's literally how the story ends, is she's just right back even more intensely into wanting revenge on Snow. So as far as Regina's character arc goes in this story, I wouldn't say she really has much of one, because she doesn't change over the course of the story at all. She's in the exact same place at the end as she was in the beginning, you know, dead set, almost psychotic in her, you know, desire for revenge against Snow. As far as the act breaks go, I could really only detect 2 acts, and that would be right here. These pages aren't numbered, so unfortunately all I can do is show you. Right here, where she falls into the pit and kind of comes to and realizes that somebody is there and that somebody has tricked her into falling into the pit. For as short as the story is, it does flow very well. Honestly, there's not much of a sense of time in it. It almost seems like it takes place in the span of 5 minutes. I mean, obviously that's not how long it takes, but that's the perception of time I take away from reading it. Again, no one page is, you know, a mini comic type deal. It's all just encapsulated in those 20 odd pages. It is very in character for Regina. It manages to portray both her evil queen-ness, and then we see glimpses of kind of pre-evil queen young Regina before she lost Daniel, in that she's trying to get through to William because she doesn't want to kill, even in self-defense, the brother of the man that she loved. So it's very in character, even if she didn't have much of a character arc. The story itself, unlike Regina's individual character arc in it, did feel very cohesive. It's very thoroughly laid out from the beginning of William setting the trap to the end of the resolution of the little battle between William and Regina. All right, and last but not least, we have chapter 4, which is called Tea Party in March. Now, this story is actually really interesting and was probably the one I was most eager to read, despite Hook being one of my favorite characters, because this story centers on, and I'll show you the same page again just so you can get a glimpse of him. The story centers on Jefferson. Now, Jefferson is the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland, and he is a character that we meet in the first season of the show. And the reason I was so eager to read this story, not only just because I love Alice in Wonderland, but unlike the other characters featured in the other 3 stories, Hook, Rumple, Belle, Regina, Jefferson is not a main character. Regina, Hook, Rumple, and Belle are all members of the main regular cast of major characters. Jefferson is not. He does play an integral, almost pivotal role in the first season of the show and just the show's general foundation. But he's not a character that's been featured a lot. He had one centric episode in the first season and then a few appearances in the second. However, the Mad Hatter is portrayed on the show by Sebastian Stan. And this would have been right around the time that he began getting involved with the Marvel Cinematic Universe as Bucky Barnes. So they have, as such, since season two, and we're now going on season 6, have not been able to bring him back, mainly due to his schedule. He's a fan favorite, but, Sebastian's very busy, so they just really haven't been able to bring him back. He wasn't even able to come back for an appearance in the spin-off show, which was Once Upon a Time in Wonderland. So, if they were going to be able to bring him back, they would have done it then. However, that was canceled after one season, so it's not an issue anymore. Anyway, as far as this story goes, this tells some very interesting backstory for Jefferson. The only backstory we ever saw on him was about how he was separated from his little daughter, Grace, which was done by Regina in the past in the Enchanted Forest. This story tells the tale of how he meets his wife, which is very sweet because we didn't know anything about Jefferson's. We didn't know anything about Grace's mother in the show other than that she was dead. That was all we ever really learned. It's a very cute story. Jefferson at this time in his life is a thief, and he meets Priscilla, a fellow thief, and they fall in love, and they have a little girl named Grace, and that's right about where I would say the second act kicks in. Is here they are, both breaking into the same king's vault, and then I would say the second act begins in this little montage of their life together, where they fall in love and they have Grace. And then what happens basically is they are not doing too well financially, so Jefferson kind of wants to fall back on old thieving habits to ensure their financial well-being. And he goes to Wonderland to steal a magical watch, and unfortunately, what ends up happening is that Priscilla dies. She eventually finds him there. She had discouraged him from returning to thievery, but she follows him there to help him because she loves him, and unfortunately, she ends up being murdered by the March Hare, who in Once Upon a Time's mythos is actually a human being. He's the guy right there in red, who gets his name March Hare from all of the rabbits that he kills, and you can see in the picture I just showed you up here, he is wearing a headdress made of their ears. That's all bloody. It's kind of gross. But yes, it's a very sad, very interesting story, though, because again, like I said, we didn't know that much about Jefferson, and he's one of the most intriguing characters on the show. So to get that little extra bit of backstory from him was very nice. He has a very complete character arc from beginning to end. This story, more so than the other three, didn't feel so condensed. It took me a little while longer to get through it than the others. I think it was longer just by page count, but I also think it was longer in the sense that there was more to the story than what we saw with the other three. Like I said, he has a very complete character arc. He goes from being a thief at the very beginning, and then there's this middle where he's a family man. He's very much in love with his wife, and he adores his little girl. And then he kind of, what I believe is called, backslides into his old ways, where he falls back on stealing. And then when that causes him to lose his wife, that wakes him up to what falling back on old habits can result in, and he returns to the Enchanted Forest from Wonderland after having lost Priscilla, and is determined to be the best father he can be for his little girl and to never leave Grace again. They do end up having to move into a hut because they can't afford where they lived before. And he, I believe, now this isn't in the book, but if I remember correctly from the show, he begins making a living as like a mushroom hunter or a market man or something like that. But his character arc from the beginning of the story to the end is very complete, and he goes through a profound change. The story flows very well. Even the montage they show of, Priscilla and Jefferson, falling in love and finding a home and having Grace all flows very, very well. You always know what's going on. There's no inconsistencies. There's no moment where it feels like too much, too much too soon, or too much info packed into the one story at all. It all flows very well and is very engaging and very intriguing. So it definitely pulls you not only into the story, but pulls you all the way through it. Oh, pardon me. Sorry, my sister's phone is going off. Anyway, it's a very cohesive story, and it's a very good read. So, all in all, Once Upon a Time Out of the Past, to me, definitely felt like a graphic novel. In my limited experience with them, when I decided to do this one, I was a little apprehensive because I'm such a big fan of the show that I thought maybe it would come off like I was just reading a script of the show, or that it wouldn't seem like a graphic novel to me, but it reads very much like one, which is appropriate because it is one. And each story is cohesive. It has a definite beginning, middle, and end. And you would think that having, featuring 4 stories with 5 different characters would seem like almost messy when you were reading it, but each story kind of feels connected in a way, even though, none of the characters overlap in any of the stories. They all kind of feel connected and like they have a central theme because they're not focused on action. We're seeing a lot of emotion from the characters. They're all going through a pretty evident emotional, internal struggle. We have Hook, who's, reconciling the fact that his brother really is dead. We have Regina, who, even though I mentioned didn't have that fantastic of a character arc within her story, is still going through a very kind of dark internal battle with kind of being confronted with what her vengeance against Snow is doing, not only to her, but to others. And Jefferson, obviously, has probably what I would call the most, I don't want to say epic, but the most deep internal struggle, I guess, because he actually loses his wife in the story. It's not like with Killian losing his brother again, because he didn't actually lost him. He lost a hallucination of him. Or Regina losing Daniel's brother, who she barely knew, so she didn't even really lose him in a sense. And Belle didn't lose anybody. So Jefferson's going obviously through a big struggle. And then Belle is going through her own with kind of reconciling her desire to be a hero and these kind of growing affectionate feelings that she has for Rumpelstiltskin. So it all feels very cohesive in that sense. Other than that, I would say if you have watched the show that you would definitely enjoy this book. There's another book, the first graphic novel they produced from Once Upon a Time. I don't specifically remember the title. I've never read it. It's about a relationship on the show I could care less about. But if you are at all interested in reading this one, I would say you could probably read that one as well, as long as you don't have any aversion to the Evil Queen and Graham the Huntsman like I do. And that basically is my analysis of Once Upon a Time Out of the Past.